He had never lost. Not once. Not ever. Until the river swallowed everything. Before we talk about the battle, before we talk about the ambush, the river, and the disaster that would haunt one man for the rest of his life, you need to understand something about Subutai. You need to understand what it meant to be him. By 1223, Subutai the Valiant had campaigned across more territory than Alexander the Great ever dreamed of. He was the supreme field commander of the Mongol Empire. Not a prince, not a nobleman. He was the son of a blacksmith, a man who had risen entirely on the terrifying precision of his mind. Genghis Khan didn't give his trust easily. He gave it to Subutai without reservation. The campaign that brought Subutai to the banks of the Volga steppe in 1223 had started 2 years earlier as something almost casual by Mongol standards, a reconnaissance in force, a probing strike sent westward to gather intelligence on peoples the Mongols had not yet encountered. Subutai commanded alongside Jebe, another of Genghis Khan's greatest generals. Together they had cut through the Caucasus like a blade through silk. They annihilated a Georgian army. They shattered the Alan Confederation. They had driven deep into the Crimean Peninsula, sacking Sudak on the Black Sea coast. These were not raids. This was systematic professional destruction, designed to gather information, test enemies, and leave nothing standing that could threaten the Mongol rear when the real invasion came. And Subutai, watching every engagement, every retreat, every attempt to stop him, was learning. He was always learning. But then the Cumans rode in to ruin everything. Because the Cumans made a decision that seemed like strategy. It was actually a trap. And by the time Subutai understood it, the ground was already moving beneath his feet. The Cumans were steppe nomads, skilled, fast, elusive. When Subutai's forces first encountered them, the Cumans did what steppe peoples always did when facing overwhelming force. They ran. They scattered into the endless grass and simply refused to be caught. But Subutai had a plan for that, too. He sent them a message, a peace offer, cloaked in Mongol diplomatic language. Essentially, we are the same people. We are both riders of the steppe. Why are we enemies? Join us, or at least stand aside. Let us pass. And the Cumans, exhausted from running, seduced by gifts of horses and silver, accepted. Then Subutai and Jebe turned on the Alans, the Cumans' former allies, with full force. The Alans, abandoned, were annihilated. And then, before the Cumans could even process what had happened, the Mongols turned back on them as well. It was a master class in psychological manipulation. Divide, isolate, destroy. The Cuman Khan, Kachin, survived, but he had lost enormous numbers of his people. Burning with humiliation, he made a decision that would pull an entirely new power into this conflict, one the Mongols had never encountered before. He appealed to the Rus princes. Kachin was clever. He didn't beg, he warned. He told the Rus princes, the Mongols will come for you next. They will not stop. Help me now or face them alone later. He sealed the appeal with gifts, horses, camels, slaves, and he made it personal. His daughter was married to Mstislav the Bold, Prince of Galicia, one of the most powerful Rus military commanders of the era. The Rus princes agreed. Not all of them. The Rus principalities were fractured, perpetually feuding, operating more as rival city-states than a unified nation. But a significant coalition assembled. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, Mstislav the Old of Kiev, Mstislav of Chernigov, and their combined Cuman allies. By the estimates of later chroniclers, the force that marched south toward the steppe numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men. Subutai had approximately 20,000. The odds were nearly even, maybe worse than even for the Mongols. This had almost never happened before. And here is where Subutai does something that looks, on the surface, like retreat, like weakness, like fear. It was none of those things. The Mongols began to withdraw, not chaotically, not in panic. They retreated in measured stages, maintaining formation, always keeping just far enough ahead of the Rus-Cuman advance that they couldn't be caught, but close enough that the coalition felt they were winning, that they were chasing something. For 9 days this continued. For Mstislav the Bold, this felt like vindication. The great Mongol warriors, these supposedly unstoppable demons from the east, were running. His cavalry was driving them back. His confidence swelled. He pushed the pace. He began to outrun the slower, heavier infantry and supply trains of the Rus coalition. He began to outrun his fellow princes. This was exactly what Subutai needed. The feigned retreat, the Mongodai tactic, was one of the foundational elements of Mongol battlefield doctrine. You didn't just retreat. You made the retreat feel like a rout. You made the enemy believe the battle was already won. You made them chase you until their formation collapsed, until their cavalry was separated from their infantry, until different commanders were pursuing at different speeds, until the unified army had dissolved into a scattered mob strung out across miles of open steppe. And then you turned. On May 31st, 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River, Subutai stopped running. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Mstislav the Bold was at the front with his Cuman allies, but the Cumans, when the Mongols turned, immediately broke. They fled, and in their flight they crashed back through the Rus infantry columns that were still marching up from behind, scattering them, creating chaos, blocking reinforcement. Mstislav the Bold found himself fighting with only a fraction of the force he'd marched with, his allies gone, his rear in disorder. He was one of the few to escape. He reportedly destroyed his own boats crossing the Dnieper to prevent the Mongols from following him. Mstislav of Kiev, the most experienced of the princes, had seen the trap forming. He refused to advance. He drew his forces into a fortified camp on a hilltop and dug in. For 3 days the Mongols besieged him. Then they offered terms, safe passage in exchange for surrender. Mstislav accepted. The Mongols killed them all anyway. The prisoners, including Mstislav the Old, were placed beneath wooden boards. The Mongol commanders held their victory feast on top of them, pressing them into the earth. The Rus princes were suffocated. It was the Mongol tradition. For enemies of great status, death without the shedding of noble blood. A death with a kind of terrible elegance. The Battle of the Kalka River was a catastrophic Rus defeat. Between a third and half of the entire coalition force was killed. 3 major princes died. The Cumans were shattered. Subutai had done the impossible. And then, with all of this achieved, with the steppe open before him, with the Rus princes broken and the road to Europe seemingly undefended, Subutai stopped. And what happened next cost him everything. After the Kalka, Subutai turned northeast. He needed to reconnect with the main Mongol army. But the route home took him through territory controlled by the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people, who had built a sophisticated trading state along the middle Volga. They were not the Cumans. They were not the Rus princes. They were not the disorganized coalitions Subutai had been destroying for 2 years. The Volga Bulgars were prepared. The Bulgars had been watching. They had observed everything. The Kalka campaign, the feigned retreats, the encirclements. They had studied how Subutai fought, and in the narrow defiles and forested riverbanks around the great bend of the Samara, where the Volga curves back on itself in a massive arc, creating terrain that compressed the Mongol column and stripped away their greatest advantage, space, the Bulgars set an ambush. We don't have detailed chronicles of this engagement the way we do with the Kalka. The sources are fragmentary, but what we know is this. The Mongol force, exhausted from 2 years of continuous campaigning, depleted from their losses, marching through terrain they didn't control, walked into it. The ambush at Samara Bend hit the Mongol column from multiple directions simultaneously. The Bulgars had apparently coordinated a sophisticated encirclement that used the river itself as a barrier on one side, preventing escape. The compressed terrain prevented the Mongols from deploying their cavalry effectively. The feigned retreat that Subutai used so masterfully required open space. Here, there was none. The Mongols suffered serious losses. The exact numbers are unknown, but the later Persian chronicler, Shusani, admittedly not a neutral source, wrote that the Bulgars annihilated the Mongol force almost entirely. Even accounting for his bias, The Rus chronicles also acknowledge the disaster. Subutai retreated, withdrew, was beaten. Think about what this moment meant for a man like him. 2 years of unbroken conquest. An operational campaign of genius that stretched from the Caucasus to the Black Sea to the Volga, the humiliation of the Rus princes, the shattering of every army placed before him. And then the river, the trees, the arrows coming from everywhere at once, men dying around him in the mud and the dark. The force he'd commanded, depleted now, bleeding, broken, retreating from a people most of the world had never heard of. Subutai had been outsmarted, had been lured, had been ambushed. The teacher had been taught. He reported back to Genghis Khan, "We don't have the exact words, but we know Genghis did not punish him, because the campaign had still achieved its objectives. Intelligence had been gathered, enemies had been assessed, route had been mapped, and Subutai was still the best general in the world." But something had changed in him, because Subutai never forgot Samara Bend, and when the Mongols finally returned to the west, 16 years later in 1236, the first people destroyed were the Volga Bulgars, completely, utterly, without mercy. And that was just the beginning. Everything Subutai learned between 1221 and 1223, every adaptation forced upon him by the Rus princes, by the Cumans, by the forests and rivers of the west, he encoded into the invasion plan he built for Bata Khan's western campaign 18 years later. The invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241 is one of the most perfectly engineered military campaigns in human history. Multiple army groups advancing on divergent axes simultaneously, coordinated across hundreds of miles, designed to prevent any single European power from reinforcing another. Poland was struck to prevent it from reinforcing Hungary. Silesia was devastated to freeze the Holy Roman Empire in place. Then Hungary, the main target, was engulfed from 3 directions. At the Battle of Mohi on the Sayo River, Subutai executed a night river crossing with tens of thousands of men that his opponent, King Bele IV of Hungary, believed was impossible. The Hungarians woke to find the Mongols already behind them. The historians who study Subutai tend to reach for the same words: unprecedented, unparalleled. He campaigned across more territory than any commander in history, over 65,000 kilometers across 3 decades. He fought in 3 different theaters simultaneously when most generals struggled with one. He won 32 separate engagements against disciplined, well-equipped armies. But the battle he lost or came closest to losing at Samara Bend in 1223, that's the one that made him who he became. Because Subutai understood something that most commanders never learn: defeat is information. The ambush taught him the limits of his doctrine in forested, riverine terrain. It taught him the danger of exhausted troops moving through unknown geography. It showed him exactly what a prepared, intelligent enemy could do to even the most sophisticated force if they understood how it operated. He had entered that campaign as a genius. He exited it as something rarer, a genius who had been tested, who had stood in the fire and not flinched, who had looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to him and taken notes. The Samara Bend didn't break Subutai, it finished him. We remember Genghis Khan. We remember the empire he built, the terror he created, the world he reshaped. But the man who actually mapped that empire, who rode ahead of it, who tested its edges, who built the operational architecture that made the great conquests possible, was Subutai. And the most important moment in Subutai's life wasn't a victory. It was a single afternoon on a river bend, surrounded by trees, with arrows coming from everywhere, realizing for the first time that he could be beaten. The greatest generals in history are not the ones who never lost. They're the ones who knew what to do with a loss.